Well,
Yeah.
hello, hello, hello. I think we're going here, and we're going to give it just a couple more minutes before we get started to let a few other people join. But wanted to thank you all for joining us for today's conversation, and that's what it's going to be. We'll get going here in just a couple of minutes. In the meantime, you get to see our smiling faces with these really cool backgrounds because you are obviously in the exact same office with this cool logo thing.
We're facing each other, aren't we? In a mirrored office?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. That's what it is. Yeah, the modern way we do meetings.
Yep.
While we get started, feel free to drop into the chat any information, either questions you came into here with, or maybe a little bit of info about yourself and your current state with Copilots, with AI, what you want to know, any of those sort of things. That would be great. Maybe even tell us where you're coming in from. We're going to try to make this very, very interactive. So feel free to drop some stuff into the chat on that. I used to do a version of this mostly for executives that we called Whiskey and Wisdom. And as you might imagine, it involved doing whiskey tasting. Those were always a little more fun. People were much more eger to jump on the chat after a couple of
Yeah, I bet.
sips of whiskey.
I'd argue the wisdom might go down as the whiskey goes up.
I would say that the wisdom went up because people
Wow.
talked, and we,
True,
sort of what,
true.
and look, that's why I'm bringing it up here with the chat. It's like this is much more interesting if you engage and
Yeah.
participate and put some stuff out there. So, all right, well, let's go ahead and get this going. We have plenty of people on, and so we would like to dive into the conversation. And as you probably have already got an inkling about, this is almost going to be the unwebinar, right? This is, I guess, it's talking heads, in that you have Tim and my heads here and we're talking, but you're not going to have a lot of slides. We have slides, but they're boring. They're very boring because what they have on them are questions. This is just going to be really an interactive session where we try to address the 10 questions, the 10 things that you need to know before you invest in a Copilot for IT. Because and I'll give you my background here in 2 seconds, but I've sat through a lot of different presentations. I've given presentations, been a part of these conversations. And the one fact that I think is unquestionable when it comes to the intersection of AI and enterprise IT is how much ambiguity there is, how many questions there are, because the understanding is all over the place. And I'm not going to say Tim and I will have all the answers. In fact, I would love for someone to stump us and to say, you know what, we don't actually know that. Let's go find that out. But I think that there is so much to uncover when we're talking about AI in the enterprise that these sort of sessions are hopefully going to be very useful and informative. So with that, we're gonna dive in. Before we do the intros and just get into the conversation, please use either the chat or the QA. We're going to be watching both uh, to throw your questions into the ring. We are happy to throw our questions out if you give us something that is meaty that will help everybody kind of understand this better. So please dive in with your questions. We're going to leave a little bit of time at the end, but frankly, we'd much prefer to have it sort of in the flow of things. So don't hesitate to drop those questions in. Um, I'll introduce myself very briefly. My name is Charles Rajo, Charlie. I am historically, well, actually, I'll give you my fuller background. I am at my core an IT guy. I ran IT operations for about $1 billion healthcare firm 25 some odd years ago. Thank God I don't have hair because it would all be gray by now, I'm sure. I then ran large scale transformation programs in financial services and healthcare for another decade. About 12 years ago, I ended up writing a book called The Quantum Age of IT, Why Everything You Know About IT is About to Change. And what it really changed was my career. I started speaking all over the world about the future of IT and what it meant to be a leader in that future. That pivoted to its focus on digital transformation. And then about 8 years ago, I put the industry analyst hat on and have been covering the space broadly of enterprise IT and the intersection with digital transformation for throughout that entire time. And it's been a whirlwind. We've seen so much change in that period. But I was ready to sort of get off the field, so to speak, or maybe get back onto the field as the case might be. And so in April, I joined Symphony AI, and I'm really heading up strategy now. And this is sort of what my job is, to try to figure out how all these pieces fit together. And so when we were talking about all of this, I thought it was really important to, we spend a lot of time, we have a Copilot, as you might imagine, talking about the product. but I thought it was going to be very important to talk a little bit, step back a little bit and say, why would we even go down that road? Why should anyone invest in a Copilot, and what do you need to know? And no one is better from our side to help answer those questions than Tim Laws. And I'll let Tim introduce himself, and then you'll see why. So, Tim.
Next time we do this, Charles, I'm going first because your background is clearly more impressive than mine, but I'll jot that down. But thank you. My name is Tim Laws. I'm Senior Director of our sales team. I've been in the ITSM industry for a little over 15 years now, probably closer to 16 years now. I started my career out as a military contractor, and I got to travel the globe doing installations for our morale, welfare, and recreation sites on our military installations. And when I wasn't doing implementations and trainings there, I was working the service desk when I was back home. So I did that for about 8 years, and then I decided to hop over to the sales side of the house, and I've been in the ITSM sales side of the house since 2016. So worked for a handful of companies, some mayonnaise. We got acquired by SolarWinds, and then about 3.5 going on 4 years ago now, I came over to Symphony AI. So thanks for having me.
All right. And what Tim sort of didn't talk about there is that he is one of our go-to guys whenever we're interacting with our most important clients. And as I mentioned, we do have a Copilot product. So he's knee deep into all of this. So, and he likewise has heard all these questions. So, we kind of come at things from different perspectives, but we get these questions a lot. And so we want to dive into it. So again, I'll reiterate, please put your questions in chat, put your questions in the Q&A as we go. Don't wait, but we're going to dive in. So Tim, I want to start with this, really the first question, sort of laying the foundation down, right? What exactly is a Copilot, and how is it different from other AI technologies or even other technologies that have sort of predated this?
Yeah, I think to start, the difference with a Copilot versus kind of a digital agent is the Copilot has generative AI technology built around it. If folks kind of knew how the sausage was made with previous chatbots or AI, they always had a dedicated input and an output with a workflow. So you could only ask it a set of predefined questions. You might have some chit chat capability, but in order for it to fulfill a request or submit an incident or give you a knowledge base article, it had to pick up on predefined phrases or key terms. And then those would be correlated in the back end to an outcome. And it was always pre-scripted. Now what we have is the technology to leverage massive LLMs and natural language processing. And so the co-pilots that we interact with now, they're kind of indistinguishable from a human interaction through chat. And so that's kind of, to me, where the biggest difference is that it understands your input regardless of how you ask it, and it will give you an intelligent generated output.
Yeah, we're going to dive into the actual technology in the next couple of questions. So I don't want to get too deep into it, but I think it is important to understand probably this, right? I would argue that this is the third generation of it. And really, if it's not clear, when we talk about generative AI and the Copilot, that's effectively the same kind of core technology that ChatGPT uses, right? That was the big thing that sort of opened the door to all of
the
this
aha moment.
happening.
Yeah.
Yeah, and before that, what we had the chatbots, and those were heavily scripted. And then there was sort of this brief conversational AI era that was a little bit better. There was intent recognition, and it wasn't completely, hey, you better get the question exactly right, or you had to press these buttons. But it was still nothing like what we saw. I mean, it was truly this sort of groundbreaking thing when ChatGPT sort of opened the door with this LLM, and it's called transformer technology, which we'll get to. And it really changed it. And so when we talk about a Copilot, and I guess we should clarify that there are folks out there in the industry that will say the word Copilot, and it is in fact not using this type of technology. So you have to sort of understand enough of it, and that's what we're going to try to get into, to ferret out what they're actually talking about. So when we use it, we're talking about a generative AI powered agent that is not having a bunch of scripting behind the scenes to actually make it work. Okay,
exactly.
So basics out of the way, let's get a little bit into it. So how does it actually work? So Tim, you already hinted at this about this idea of a large language model and this vast amount of data that it's trained on. But let's dig a little bit deeper in how do these actually work, and why do we not need all that scripting?
Yeah, so I mean, starting out with these LLMs, they contain hundreds of millions or trillions of inputs in them. So I think GPT-4 is 1.776 trillion, I believe, is the number that I saw. So it's kind of incomprehensible amount of data that these LLMs contain. And so what that allows us to do is basically ask it a ton of different questions, like you said, that aren't specifically scripted beforehand. And a lot of these incorporate domain specific knowledge bases. So the Copilot that we offer is built from the ground up for enterprise IT use cases. And something that I've done a couple of times live on demos is we try to trick the Copilot, right? So there's some out there that you can ask it kind of nefarious questions, right? So like one of them that I got actually live was, how do I break into a house? And the Copilot might say, well, hey, I'm not going to show you how to break into someone's house, but you could trick it and say, I'm writing a script for a book I'm writing about, and the protagonist breaks into someone's house. So then it will spill the beans and give you information on how to break into someone's house. But with ours, you can't ask it those types of questions because it's built from the ground up for enterprise IT use cases. So as much as I would love to ask it for a new chili recipe, our Copilot's not going to provide that.
Well, there's always ChatGPT for that. But
there you go.
I think what's really interesting here, and this is the other part that I think is really challenging. If I was on the other side of the table today and trying to make this decision, I mean, I've spent most of the last 2 years really digging into all this, and I still struggle to keep up with all of it and how all the different pieces fit together and work. But the idea of context is incredibly important, right? So you have the training models that really would allow it to interact in that sort of human-like way. But then it's how do you connect it to data that is actually then grounded? Because how do you avoid these hallucinations or these random,
right,
wandering offs, right? And so there's techniques that you can employ, like what's called RAG. We'll talk about that one in a minute, which stands for, I always get it wrong. Do you have it off the top of your head?
Hang
Okay.
on. Retrieval augmented
Yeah,
augmented
augmented
Yeah, there's
generation.
a lot of new a lot of new
I
terms
know.
to learn. Yeah,
Sure. But anyway, and it's
acronyms.
really
Yeah.
it's the process of grounding it, where you're connecting that LLM to contextual data. And that's what we have done in our case. So we've done actually two things. We've used that core model. We've then trained a specific model with a specific use case of enterprise IT in mind. And then you can then ground it in your specific enterprise data using RAG. You start forgetting what the terms mean anymore to
Yeah.
do it. And so you have to really understand all of the sort of underpinnings of how it works. So it's the LLM is what allows it to have that interaction, and then that grounding in the contextual data is what allows it to actually work specifically in the context of your situation. And that's the part where people miss, because there's a lot of organizations go, oh yeah, well, we have generative AI, and really all they've done is they've used the OpenAI or the Azure AI API, and they've plugged it in. Well, you just have ChatGPT in your environment now, and you got to hope that it can actually add value. And so it's really those next two layers where you're training the model specifically on the context that you need, and then connecting it to knowledgeable, authoritative data sources that is critical. Anything else you want to add before we?
Yeah, since you mentioned APIs, I mean, APIs are very important depending on the objectives of the organization. So, our Copilot is designed to kind of hook into as much of the tech stack that will be allowed by the organization, so that you can support as many use cases as possible. So, if I'm an employee and I'm a new employee and I have to ask about our insurance policy, that needs to be able to pull the data potentially from your HRIS system or your documentation repository to get that information too. So having those open API connectors in the background allows the Copilot to be more robust and to gather those answers, kind of like, I mean, the way that I always describe it is it's your best friend within the organization. It's got all the answers for you. It's there 24/7, 365, either through a portal or Microsoft Teams or Slack or something like that. But if you can expand its reach within the organization, it can gather that information quicker and generate those insights better for the end user.
Yeah, I'm going to go to this next question just because we're already sort of talking about it. But you did
Yeah.
bring up something that I realized we sort of glossed over, and that is that a Copilot, by definition, is something that sort of sits off to the side, like you said, that assistant, that person, or that not person, but the computer, that technology is always there. It's what it feels like it. I use it every single day, and
Soon
so it feels
enough,
like it's
yeah.
yeah.
I know.
It sits there, and then you're able to interact with it to ask the things that you need to ask, and it gives you that insight. And then the other thing that you just pointed to that again we should point out is that, at least when they're done well, like ours, pat ourselves on the back here, it will also allow you to bridge systems, right? Where you can now ask it a question that requires data and context from multiple backend systems, and it can assimilate all that and bring it together synthesize it and give you a response with that context, much like a person who had knowledge in these different
Mhm.
environments would do. So, which leads to this question, right? And I think we're obviously already answering it. Is the
Yeah.
technology behind the copilots mature enough? And I think clearly the answer is yes, but with some caveats. So you've already explained some of the why it's ready, right? We can ground it with authoritative data sources, we can connect it. But what are some of the caveats that you might put out there?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it's going to be the scope of the work there. So, defining the use case specifically, I think, is really important in an organization. So, knowing kind of what your objectives are going to be, the maturity of the vendor as well. I mean, Copilot is kind of a term that's synonymous. Everyone's using Copilot. They're kind of slapping it on whatever they need to right now, and that's actually one of the questions in the chat that we can get to later. Is Copilot? Everyone's got a Copilot now, and for some reason that's not copywritten, so everyone can kind of use it. But there's a ton of companies out there that are using Copilots or advertising that they have Copilots. So I would definitely say do your due diligence and make sure that their Copilot functionality is matching up with what your use cases are and the problems that you're trying to solve. Because with these LLMs and natural language processing, it may seem on the surface level that you can have a conversation with this Copilot and get what you're looking for, but unless you kind of do some due diligence or do a proof of concept, that might not always be the case.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that idea of how you ground it and how you leverage it is all important, and which is why you're saying. So, let's stress this one. Somebody asked the question: is it the same as the Microsoft Copilot?
Yep.
No, we are a partner with Microsoft. We are leveraging and you can correct me if I'm getting the terminology wrong here, Tim. The OpenAI Azure um, LLM connection, which is
Yep.
the OpenAI's LLM that is hosted on Azure that Microsoft provides.
Yep.
So it's the back end is very similar to what a Microsoft Copilot does, but this is proprietary. This is what we built
Mm-hmm.
on top of that platform specifically. And this was another question specifically for service management in general, right? So specifically for really, I would say the enterprise IT use case. So it is that we've tuned the model for enterprise IT use cases with obviously a focus on service management in general. Now it is you're into Tim's point. So we have three versions of this, three sort of persona based versions of it. Microsoft, I think, has 137 of them now. So this is
Mm-hmm.
another challenge, right? This is all the tuning, and you have to sort of make a decision on what actually makes sense for you in that context. Was there anything
Yeah,
else you wanted to add there?
we got a couple questions popping up, but one other thing before we dive into the questions is security. Security is incredibly important here as well because you're going to be potentially connecting your infrastructure to a Copilot, and depending on the back end of the Copilot, for example, ours is single tenant. So ours is a dedicated implementation per customer. So that data stays with that customer. So we're not commingling that data in the background. So you don't have to worry about your proprietary information, getting in the hands of potentially through a security breach, another customer of ours or competition out there. So that's something that's very important as well. But we've got a question here from Robert and Daniel. So Robert wants to know, is our Copilot trained for ITSM or service management more generally? Since we brought up human resource example. So yeah, ours is designed from the ground up with, we're calling it enterprise IT, but IT, service management, and asset management in mind. But obviously that nowadays goes way beyond just IT use cases. Every end user in an organization is a customer that has a support representative kind of linked to them, whether that's in finance, if I have a payroll issue, or human resources, if I have an insurance question, or kind of the traditional IT side of the house. But this can go way beyond that too. I mean, we're solving now for security use cases. So we've got some with retail customers where if someone goes into a grocery store and tries to run out with a 12-pack of beer, this can process a security form for them and generate a police report. So it's built for all those kind of standard use cases, but it can also go way beyond that as well.
Which leads to
And
one of the other questions that we might as
yep.
well address while we're on this topic, and that is our Copilot able to connect
Mm-hmm.
with just ITSM systems, or also like contact centers and ACD and what have you?
So yeah, the answer is absolutely yes to that. There's not really a limit in what we can connect to in the background. So Daniel, good to see you again, buddy. I hung out with Daniel in Milwaukee this past weekend. We got to go to a Brewers game. That was a lot of fun. So yeah, it absolutely can. I mean, that's why we offer that open API in the back end. So that way you can ingest that information. And something that we're going to be working on later is those inputs. So whether right now it's going to be obviously texting that's coming in, but voice to text, things like that, all that stuff is coming kind of down the pipeline. So I think this can definitely work in contact centers for sure.
Yeah, and I think it's also important, especially if you're in a large enterprise, there's a good chance you have more than one ITSM system. So
Yep.
this is something that we are certainly doing, and this is part of our ethos, right? At the end of the day, we are focused on what we call simplicity, transparency, and flexibility, right? We want to make everything that we do simple. This isn't meant to be a sales pitch, right? But it's important
Yep.
to understand the different contexts because not everyone is going to take this approach. In our case, you can use this Copilot because it is this open architecture beneath the covers to connect to other ITSM systems. So
Mm-hmm.
either if you're in the process of a transition, or if you are in an environment where you maybe have different business units that are each using different systems, and you want to provide a common interface to a customer, right? Something that I've spent a ton of time focused on is the idea of the customer experience and the employee experience as
Yep.
drivers of value. If you wanted to do that, then you can connect it to those systems, and it can help you sort that out and provide that unified interface. Same, just as we were talking about integrating context between, like, say, HR and IT, you can use it for the same purpose when you're bridging against multiple ITSM systems.
Yep.
But all of this
100%.
sort of leads to this question that we sort of talked about already, and that is, what are the different types? There's lots of different types, and I think that that's one of the challenges when you're in the market or you're even just starting to think about, is there a place for an enterprise copilot? There are a lot of them, and I
Mm-hmm.
think we obviously have our opinion in how we are approaching it, and as you can probably tell, we're sort of trying to strike this balance. We have these three persona based co-pilots, but we are prejudicing it by focusing on the enterprise IT use case, and then we're really trying to otherwise be as homogenistic as we can, but there's other strategies, right? There are people that are
Mm-hmm.
developing very, very narrow copilots, including Microsoft, right? That's why they have
Yep.
137 of them. Some of them are extremely narrow,
Yep.
and there's other
Specific. Yep.
players in the market, yeah, that have these very narrow ones. And so I think it's important to understand what it is, what's important to you, and how you're looking, what role you're looking this to play. So I'm curious, Tim, you spend a lot of time in the field talking to our
Yep.
clients about this. How are you seeing people kind of trying to strike this balance or weigh this out?
Yeah, I mean, as you kind of mentioned, there's a Copilot for what seems like everything now. So you've got the IT support Copilot that we're kind of talking about now. You've got security Copilots, operation Copilots. I mean, Microsoft is pushing their Copilot on us for productivity, right? So it's kind of everywhere you look, there's now this generative AI Copilot that can assist you. And again, I think what it starts with is knowing knowing what the customer expectations are. So just kind of listing some of those copilots out. I mean, we cover a lot of those. So obviously we have the copilot for the end user. We have a copilot for the analysts that are within the platform. That copilot can generate insights. It can automatically link tickets to the right categories, subcategories, work groups, urgency, impact, things like that as well. But then on the back end, we also have a service automation module. That service automation module has a copilot that comes along with it, and you can say, just write out what you're trying to do to create the code for that. So you can say, hey, I need a Python script to connect Symphony AI's enterprise IT platform to Workday for employee onboarding or employee offboarding, and that will write the script for you in our service automation module. So, ours is more of kind of a package sell. You can kind of itemize it and break it down if you want to, but I think getting input on what objectives you're trying to solve for will dictate what type of copilot you need to implement within your environment.
And I think it's also important to really recognize you're not going to end up with one. Even,
Yep.
and like I said, we're trying to strike a balance where you maybe only have a couple, but even beyond that, you're going to be, because there's a whole bunch of folks that have copilots out there, and in many cases, very, very specific use cases. So if you
Mm-hmm.
look at the observability space, there's many of those vendors now that have Copilot specifically to help with that part of the operation, and that's not. I think it's going to be almost impossible to find a single Copilot that can cover everything you would need, even from
Yep.
an enterprise IT perspective, let alone the enterprise overall. And so I think that is critical. You need to have a very clear understanding of what it is you're trying to achieve,
Yeah,
who you're trying to deliver it to, and then make sure that the model is tuned to deliver that outcome that you're seeking.
exactly. Yep.
Speaking of, we've been throwing around all these terms. I think it's time we get into a few of these terms.
Yeah.
And I think we've defined some of them, but I think there's some others that we need to kind of clarify. And if you didn't catch it, Salesforce had Dreamforce their big user conference last week. And of course, Mark Benioff announced it was the end of the Copilot era, which of course I chuckled at because as far as I'm concerned, we barely started the Copilot era. But as an example, they are leveraging what they call, well, that's not what they call, but another term called large action models, which leads into this whole idea of agentic AI or AI agents. And this is the idea of effectively bridging the gap between an LLM, which is simply giving you information, to an LLM that can actually take action. So that's
Action.
an
Yeah.
example of when you're going to hear a lot about agentic AI and AI agents, and it's something that we are also going down that road. I think we have a little bit. We're taking a fairly cautious attitude, and certainly that's from feedback we've heard from our customers. That particularly when you're talking about critical IT operations, this autonomous action is something you need to tread lightly with. So we're taking a cautious approach with that. But I'm curious, Tim, what are some of your favorite bugaboos or favorite terms that often either get missed or misunderstood?
There's a lot of new acronyms to learn. So we already touched on LLMs. You just touched on LAMs, but we've got RAG that we touched on before as well. You've got NLP, natural language processing, ML, machine learning, APIs, things like that as well. So basically what all this kind of boils down to in the background is so large language models is kind of what is that connected to in the background. And Google has their own, Meta has their own, Microsoft has OpenAI, obviously. So there's a ton of different flavors that are out there as well. And then grounding you talked about as well. So linking authoritative sources to the Copilot. And then you've got webhooks and API integrations. I mean, I think that's really kind of what makes our Copilot shine. Like I mentioned before, is if we can have connectors to multiple platforms within an organization, we can create that one-stop shop. And that includes, webhooks into the communication platforms as well. So Microsoft Teams, Slack, Google Chat. If I can just pull out my cell phone and ask the Copilot a question, that's what I'm gonna do. That, to me, that's my shortest route to get the answer, right? Is to pull out my cell phone wherever I'm at. I could be in the kitchen making a cup of coffee, but I want to report about our service desk, or I'm traveling. We were just talking about the event that we're coming up to in Orlando in November. If I want to know what our travel policy is while I'm burning my toast in the morning, I can do that on my cell phone and get that information there. So there's a lot of acronyms to learn and a lot of new language. But I don't know, it's exciting. Obviously fun to learn new
So
stuff.
can you ask it how not to burn your toast though? I mean, that would probably be
Yeah.
useful.
My wife certainly
So I
wants to
want to
know.
pick I want to pick up on a couple of these. And actually, I want to really quick, you said something. So we're actually talking about this trip that we're going to. And I have to admit, it didn't even occur to me. I was actually just wondering, what is our travel policy? And I thought,
Yeah.
you're right. I need to go use our own Copilot. And this is going to be one of the things that, we spend a lot of time talking about technology, but the how you get people used to using it and leveraging it is
Hmm.
also a really critical part of it. But I want to hit on a couple of key terms here. One is this idea of prompt engineering. We've talked a lot, or if you followed this, it was something that was early on. There was talk about there being an entire category of job about prompt engineers.
Hmm.
I think that's all proving to be fairly false insofar as everyone's going to need to know how to do this. But prompt engineering is just literally how you talk to a a generative AI chatbot, right?
Yep.
Or how do you interact with a copilot? And so I think that's an important thing, but it's also, as far as I'm concerned, I look at it, it's like it's on organizations like ours to simply make the system smarter, that you don't really need to be quote unquote engineering a prompt to do it. But that is still a sort of a thing now. The other thing I think it's important to understand is that we throw around all these terms like Gen AI and machine learning and deep learning and fail to sort of recognize that they're all very interrelated, that artificial intelligence is this big giant category, that the transformer technology, which is what the chat GPT based stuff and all of these copilots are based on, is really a function of deep learning, which is a function of machine learning, right? These are
Hmm.
all related. And so the other thing I think that's really important to recognize that this is one branch, right? And so in addition to the generative AI, there's the predictive AI branch, which is really the element that is looking at the same data and looking for patterns. So it's again another form of machine learning, that's looking at the data to forecast, to predict events. And so the challenge with a large language model or a generative AI approach is that it's simply basing out words. It's literally guessing the next
Hmm.
word in a sequence, right? And so if you ask it to predict something, it's going to do that simply based on what its model has as far as what words often follow one after the other. In a predictive AI model, it's actually using that data to identify historical patterns and use that to predict it. So it's much more reliable. And when you merge those two together, suddenly this becomes interesting. So and frankly, I think we do a bad job of explaining this. But one of the things that our Copilot does is it's connected back to our predictive AI models to actually give that authoritative look that it's not just sort of guessing based on the next
Yep.
language. And so I think it's really important you know to try to get through all this. And obviously we can't cover it all now. So highly recommend you sort of spend some time digging into all of these terms. And it is overwhelming. It's way too much, but there's definitely a lot to it.
Yep, for sure.
Okay, let's keep going. So now let's get down to sort of more of the business side. How can an organization determine if it's the right time to invest in a co-pilot? So, Tim, you've spent a lot of time again with our clients and with people that are potentially examining our product.
Hmm.
What do you see?
So it's kind of a loaded question because I think there's a lot of ways to answer this. Typically what we start with are what are the pain points? So, a consumer of this product had some sort of trigger to start their search. Why did they start looking for a Copilot? And that comes from some sort of problem that they're trying to solve. So it could be that they get bogged down with a lot of mundane requests. They get a lot of similar service catalog requests. They get a lot of incidents that are coming in that aren't getting deflected for one reason or another. And it's taking a lot of the time of the service desk or the fulfiller in those situations. It could be that they want to open up the communication methods with the support team. So a lot of folks, email the ticket. We try to push people away from that, but that's still kind of the foundation of communication within an organization. And perhaps maybe they've started leveraging more Teams or Microsoft products, and so now they want to have the service desk available 24/7 in other areas. So that's kind of that's typically where we start kind of evaluating the maturity of the client. If they've had a service portal in the past and they can't get folks to use it, then we try to challenge them and say, well, why will a Copilot make this easier? And we obviously bring our proof points to the table to help with that. And then also gauging the return on investment too. So I talked about bogging down the service desk. We have a lot of really cool metrics that we're going to release very soon here through a third-party vendor that talks about how automating and kind of incident deflection and self-fulfillment of service requests can save hundreds of thousands of dollars to the organization. So it's freeing up resources, freeing up their time. And most importantly, you're getting the end user the answer or the fulfillment that they need as fast, I'm not even going to say as fast as humanly possible because a human's not even doing it anymore, as fast as automation can allow for. And a lot of times, you can take the human out of the loop if you have a Copilot that's involved there. So I think that's kind of that was a loaded answer to a loaded question as well. But there's a lot of things that can determine whether it's the right time to invest in a Copilot. Honestly, money comes down to most of it. If they can free up resources and that's going to be the big ROI, then that kind of determines if they should pursue it or not.
Yeah, I mean, so when I look at this, I think the ROI is actually super easy to justify because we've been seeking self-service and this idea of deflection for a very long time,
Years,
and
yeah.
it's easy to understand why, right? Because our service desk staff is an expensive resource, and
Hmm.
as our needs grow in the enterprise, you have to add more staff, or you have to find out another way to deal with it, or what most organizations have done, just keep piling more on the service desk, which is a recipe for burnout and challenges there, right?
Hmm.
And so I think the ROI is simple. However, you do have to look at a handful of things, right? I think the organizational culture and the readiness for adoption is critical. And that also
Yep.
involves, I think, your preparedness to, again, sort of change the mindset of how people interact. If you simply throw it out there and go, hey, okay, we have this thing you can use, well, no one's going to really use it. I mean, I think, people like OpenAI are helping because they're normalizing, and Meta, right? They're normalizing the idea of these chatbots, but you still have to make the effort to actually drive a cultural shift that this is a new
Right.
way of interacting. And likewise, you need to have good data and you need to have good workflows, right? One thing
Hmm.
that we often miss in all the hype around AI is that data and workflows are what underpin the effective use of AI. Microsoft is running into this in a lot of cases where, even at a productivity level, they're trying to leverage copilots and they find, again, because it's not horribly well grounded necessarily, right? That the data is a mess and therefore it's not actually providing a lot of value and can actually slow things down. And so having a data estate, having workflows that are actually well established and somewhat
Yep.
mature can go a long way. Now, by the same token, we talked about it being a bridge. I think it can also, if it's done well or with the right mindset, can actually also help bridge that gap. If you are trying to overcome some of those workflow gaps, particularly if you have business units that maybe aren't on the same page or whatever, you can actually use a Copilot to help with that if you go in with that mindset. So I think it's not something I certainly don't think that you should just do it because. I think that's not going to be a good use. You need to go in with a very determined mindset about what it is you hope to achieve. But once you get there, I think the ROI is actually fairly easy to
Yeah.
justify.
Yeah, something you touched on too is employee satisfaction. I think that's something that we hear quite a bit as well. Is if an employee submits an incident kind of the old-fashioned way through email, it might sit for a couple of days with the service desk before they get an answer. And that's just a fact of life because, like you said, IT departments are doing more with less right now, and they got more and more work to thrown on them. So the Copilot can certainly solve that because it's available 24/7, 365 on any of the communication platforms that you want to connect it to. So to me, that's kind of the biggest thing is we live in a society now where people expect things to be done at the drop of a hat. Um, and the Copilot can certainly assist with that. So that'll take down the mean time to resolution. You're getting folks answers, like I said, almost instantaneously within a couple of seconds that could have taken a couple of days before.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you brought it up because it's actually one of the things that I focus on a ton, and I meant to say that and I forgot. But I do think that, in fact, I would actually argue. So the next question is right beyond the self-service. How can
Yep.
copilots transform IT support and operations? That's the first thing I would say. This is not just about deflection. Deflection is
Hmm.
important. It's an important first step, and it's the easiest way to justify an investment in a copilot. But I think that the employee experience, I mean, it is, I ran IT 25 years ago. And back then, when we had nowhere near the level of complexity that the modern IT organization does, we struggled with, that IT was Department of No, and they, hated
Yeah.
us. And if you get me over a
Right.
beer
Right.
sometime, I'll
Exactly.
tell you some of the stories about it, right? And it just it's and so it's even harder now. I mean, significantly
Hmm.
harder now,
Hmm.
right? And so when you can deliver an experience where people are delighted, where they go, "Oh my gosh, that was so amazing. I was able to go and do this, and I got this instant response, and it took care of my problem." This is where the agentic side starts to come into play.
Yep.
It's incredibly powerful. But there's other ways, even beyond that I think are important. So what are some of the other things that you see as that copilots, when we start to get to that maturity, can be transformative?
Yeah, I think efficiency in decision making and consistency in responses is something that's kind of key as well. I mean, I was certainly guilty of this when I first started my career out on the service desk because I thought I knew the answer to something because I saw it in a previously resolved incident. And guess what? We were both wrong. And sometimes the customer calls you out on that. So, allowing the technology to truly understand what is the right answer, and making the analyst as efficient as possible. So instead of writing out a lengthy SOP that they need to follow or searching for a document within the knowledge base to link to this request, it can automatically import that stuff for you and just send it out. So you're saving a ton of time there. Allowing staff to focus on bigger ticket problems is another thing that we hear from our customers quite a bit, is that this has allowed them to free up resources because now they have an allotment of hours they didn't have before because the team was bogged down. So when they start to realize that, hey, they're kind of breaking free from these mundane tasks or these things that they give just a tier one support and they live in that all day, the same type of incidents that are coming in, guess what? Now we can do, again, more with less, and we can accomplish more because we have to put less resources into solving these incidents, getting the knowledge base articles to those end users correctly the first time. It's not just about deflection, but deflection is a big part of it too. If we can track that they've used the Copilot and an incident was not generated because they received the correct knowledge base article, I mean, that's a win all around for sure. So there's a lot that can kind of go into this, but it's definitely beyond kind of the traditional use case of just ticket deflection. I agree 100% with you, Charlie.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, I almost get frustrated with it because that has been I mean, even again, predating all this, the conversational AI, that was the big mantra. It's all about deflection, deflection, deflection. And I actually say deflection is almost the least important I look at three big
Mm-hmm.
buckets, right? The employee experience we talked about, right? Just transforming the way they interact and the service we're delivering. Let's also talk about the analyst experience or the
Mm-hmm.
IT operator experience, right? Because how much time do we spend? I mean, you and I have both lived with this. We end up with crappy
Yep.
data in our system because
Yep.
we're putting the burden on them to enter all this stuff. Oh, and by the way, let's make sure we have first call resolution rates up, and let's make sure we drive through all this stuff. And so we end up just putting junk stuff in there because we're just trying to get through it. And that's mostly because we're spending all of our time hunting around looking for solutions. We're having to
Exactly.
type up the after action reports or the summary of the thing. And AI can help with all that. It can help surface all those issues so you're not having to dig around for it and help you generate the response of what you did so we can create a knowledge article out of it, right? Take away all of that sort of mundacity
Yeah.
around it. And so I think that's critical. And then the third thing that I think is that we really can't ignore in any of this is that it also is going to sort of set that stage for changing the way we make decisions, or maybe the best way of thinking about this is not missing things, right? One of the, and
Right.
I know in the demo that you often give, and by the way, if you were interested in a demo, please hit us up in the chat, or we'll be happy to give you a private demo of all of this. But that
Mm-hmm.
wasn't the purpose of today's call. But when we do give a demo, one of the most important things is like, well, what are the critical incidents that I'm missing, right? What are the things that I need to know that maybe aren't on my radar? And when you can have that assistant, that Copilot, that you can ask those questions and it surfaces that thing, then suddenly you're not dropping the ball on something that you just don't need to drop the ball on, right? Because it's helping you
Yep.
identify those gaps. And so when you look at those three things, suddenly it's about so much more than deflection if you approach it right.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
Okay, so let's talk brass tacks. Someone has decided they're going down this road. Yes, we're going to go down the Copilot. We're going to just wow our teams. What does success look like? How would you measure it? I mean, what's your take? What are you seeing?
Data, data, data. So again, kind of going back to what were the initial pinpoints for the prospect to search out a Copilot, and then how are we measuring against that? So employee satisfaction, I think, is always is a fantastic one. But then you've got the one, the metrics that the service desk leaders are interested in. So what's our mean time to resolution? Things like that. So if those are going down, and then you can correlate to the Copilot interactions, I think that's obviously going to be a great proof point to kind of measure this down. Reduction in escalations as well. So how long did it take an incident to go to that next level? Maybe it's automatically set to the tier 3 support and it's getting the attention that it's needed, or it's automatically flagged as a major incident. But also, how many are we not kicking up to those guys? Because those are usually big ticket folks, right? They're getting paid the big bucks because they know the most. So how many of those are we solving without escalating is another really good one there. And then adoption rate as well. So we mentioned, email to ticket is still kind of tried and true. But if we can reduce the number of those tickets coming in, that means we are leveraging the technology that we have allocated and paid for within the organization. And then hopefully those tickets that are coming in through the Copilot, they're getting solved way faster than the ones that are coming in through email. So pushing and, like you said, kind of training the audience to adapt to new technology is another great metric that you can look at.
Yeah, I think clearly are people using it, right? So that's the
Yeah.
first thing that you need to always be looking at. Are people using it? That's the adoption rate. And then the second thing, and this is I think you need to look maybe a little deeper than just raw satisfaction, but specifically, is it helping them? Do they feel it's actually making
Mm-hmm.
their job easier? And we want the answer to be yes. If the answer is no, and there's some interesting data right now, not about us or even about enterprise IT copilots, but about generative AI chatbots in general right now, that answer is not always yes. That in many
Yep.
cases, people are reporting that. In fact, I think the last number was 70% of people reporting it's actually making their job harder. Well, that's obviously
Mm-hmm.
not a success thing,
It's
right?
not great.
So we need to
Yeah.
be asking, yeah, we need to be asking the right questions and looking at it from that right perspective. And then the last thing is what you should ultimately see is the rising tide that floats all boats. And
Mm-hmm.
a CIO buddy of mine gave me this classic example, nothing to do with copilots, but and I won't even give the specifics of what it was, but he deployed this technology, and he said the key was simultaneously we saw, in this case, it was healthcare, patient satisfaction rose, we were delivering better patient outcomes, and our costs were going down. We were driving increased efficiency. And ultimately,
It's a
that's what you
win-win.
should be looking for in a
Yep.
Copilot, right? That's how you know you're getting this right, because people are happier and you're getting that deflection
Hmm.
rate and you're saving money, right? And
Yep.
and so, but it also means that you need to go into this, and this is why it's really critical that you not just slam it in there or just drop it off to the side and go use it if you want. You have to
Right.
benchmark that data up front so that you can see what those results look like on the back end.
Yeah, and I think investing time in spreading the word, spreading the gospel that this technology now exists. So we can certainly help with that during implementation. But whether it's creating interactive videos that you can send out to folks on your service portal, or your intranet, things like that as well. But letting them know this technology now exists and what it's capable of. And so we've helped some customers come up with some specific use cases to send out. Say, hey, you guys try this. Look how fast this can solve XYZ. Now that we have the Copilot, you don't have to wait for us to reply to it. There's no more human in the loop. This is all, figuring it out on the fly within a matter of seconds.
Yeah, and I think we have to acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of bad history with this. We've rolled
Yeah.
out really bad chatbots in enterprise C2 over the years,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so there's
Totally.
going to be a lot of reticence that we have to acknowledge and address up front. And
Yep.
speaking of that, you talked about preaching the gospel. We clearly are true believers here. We believe in this technology. We obviously sell it. We think it is transformative, but that doesn't mean it's perfect, right? And so
Hmm.
let's talk let's get real about what are the risks and the challenges, right? What are the things that we need to be concerned about, not just with our solution, with any solution that you should be looking at, and are there any things we can do to mitigate it?
Yeah, I mean, security to me is always going to be top of mind with this or any emerging technology that's out there, right? So doing your due diligence on that, asking the right questions of the vendor. How secure is this Copilot? Where is it getting its data from? Is it sharing its data in the back end? Are we training its model? Things like that as well are all very important questions to ask. And that's really just to protect the consumer and their data. So we've taken the approach, like I mentioned before, of having our architecture be a single tenant architecture, which is definitely a benefit in our mind. But there's some vendors that are out there that are multi-tenant, and for a fact that they're commingling the data in the back end. And while it's probably logically separated, there's always a potential risk of that data kind of commingling if something bad were to happen. Um, Potential biased or incorrect responses. That's something that we need to be cognizant of as well. And that kind of goes along. If everything's working correctly with this, then there might be an over reliance on AI. And we've taken humans completely out of it. You're trusting it at face value, where it is an amazing technology. It might not always be right. And so we have to use critical thinking. And I think you could make the argument we have to use more critical thinking outside of this conversation, outside of Copilot, right? We live in the Instagram generation where folks are just, reading headlines and not actually doing their research. So I think critical thinking really comes into it as well. But I mean, it can be an absolutely wonderful and powerful tool if it's implemented correctly.
Yeah, I think that the biggest risk in all of this is that you go in, I mean, all the way back to where we started, that you go into this without a clear intention, a clear objective of what you hope to achieve. And I think that's where you can get yourself into trouble across all of these things you talked
Yeah.
about, right? I do think it's really, really critical. If I was back in the owning IT seat and looking at deploying this, I'd be really looking at probably three things, right? One is my data estate. Do I have the right data? Because that's going to drive everything that the Copilot is going to be pulling from.
Yeah.
Secondly, how do I keep a human in the loop, particularly during the initial stages? How do I ensure
Hmm.
that I'm watching these? I don't want to throw this out there and just replicate bad experiences of the
And just
past. So I
assume
want to
it's going
make
to work.
sure.
Yeah.
Exactly, right. So keeping that, so I think there's an extremely active role, particularly for the service desk in these initial stages, to sort of
Hmm.
keep your hands on it. And then the third thing is I'm really focusing on that cultural adoption piece of it, encouraging people to use it with the belief that it actually is delivering a better experience on both sides, right? And I think we've alluded to this, but there's the co-pilot, and I think we mostly tend to think about this in terms of the customer facing, but the analyst Copilot is just as important and probably
Yeah.
harder from a cultural adoption standpoint. Getting your IT team, and it's not, we say analysts, it's not just service desk, it's across the IT operational landscape,
Hmm.
getting them used to that I've got this resource that I can constantly turn to and not falling up on going through the normal digging through the folders on SharePoint or
Yeah.
whatever to try to find the
Right.
information to go here first. That's a major cultural shift. And I think if you don't address that, it's going to fall apart every single time, technology aside. And so I think that's a really significant concern.
Yep. We've
And then
got
our
two new
last question.
questions.
Okay,
Sorry.
shoot.
We've
Yeah,
got two
hit it.
new questions in the chat I was going to address. So one of them you just kind of touched on actually. So how does the Copilot help service desk agents in Symphony? And it's not just within our product Apex, it's within any ITSM product out there, but it can generate insights instantaneously. So we can read the incident, so the subject and description, and then generate those insights for the analyst. It can automatically assign the incident to the right work group, the next available analyst, categorize it, subcategorize it, dictate the impact, the urgency. It also can dictate the chances of this type of incident being escalated based on multiple factors there as well. So the goal for the analyst side is to help make them as efficient as possible. So if it didn't come in through the Copilot, whether it's on Teams or through a portal, once that incident is ingested into the system, the Copilot is analyzing all that information. So giving them the right knowledge-based article, giving them the right solution, things like that as well, so that they can be as efficient as possible and kind of what we talked about, Charles, data integrity and making sure that the answers that are being sent out of the service desk are the most accurate as possible. We have another question. So data is key to measuring success. How is this facilitated with your Copilot that will need to integrate with source systems, or in our case, our legacy ITSM ServiceNow? So we have all the metrics in the background that we can gather. Right now, it's not in a graphical setup. That's something that we're going to be releasing very soon. So there'll be kind of like a Copilot workbench, you can call it, its own kind of module where you can have all these metrics in a dashboard. But right now we have it all as raw data that can be exported. But like I said, we're going to have a graphical interface very soon.
I'm glad you could answer that one because I did not know the answer to that question. Almost, you got to have whoever did that one. You got a half stump point. Half stump point.
There you go.
Yep. All right. Our last question. We're almost out of time. And this was just kind of navel gazing a little bit into the future, but I think it's important as we try to envision where this goes, because this technology is changing so quickly, right? What is the evolution? How should organizations prepare for what is coming next? I know I have my opinions, but what do you think, Tim?
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited about the predictive side of things. I mean, you can go down a rabbit hole, and this can be like Skynet, or I forget the Tom Cruise movie where they know you're going to commit a crime before you commit it. But I'm super excited about that. I mean, this is in its infancy, and it's already really powerful today. So for the future, I mean, our Copilot right now is all text entry. But that being said, I can imagine this being, like Siri and the Google Assistants are only getting smarter, so that's going to have Copilot built into it, I'm assuming. So it's going to be with you all the time, is what I'm imagining. Flash forward 5 years, you've got AirPods on. It's going to be in your AirPod. You're going to be able to ask it any darn question you want to. It's going to be in your glasses soon, or your contact lenses, things like that. I mean, speaking of rabbit holes, I'll try to dig myself out of this one. But the Copilot's going to be everywhere. You're going to be asking it any and every question about life, work, whatever, through multiple communication methods.
So I guess we should qualify here that Tim is not giving us a product roadmap here, just so we're all clear.
No, yes, safe harbor, safety harbor. That's not on our roadmap.
Someone was kind enough to say that the movie was called Minority Report. I love that
Minority
movie.
Report. I was going to say Vanilla Sky. That was the other one. Yeah, Minority Report. That's a good movie.
I think I look at it and there's two big things, and what you just alluded to, I call ambient technology, that it is going to be omnipresent sort of everywhere, and you won't have to think that hard. And we're already doing some of that in our current roadmap, where we're injecting some of this proactive and predictive elements directly into the workflow, where it just sort of happens, right? That proactive side. And then the other thing you also just alluded to, I think is really critical, is this idea of personalization or contextual awareness. So right now we have 3 personas, and that's how we've tuned the model. I do think, again, not roadmapped right now, but I think where this technology overall evolves to is that we end up with everyone effectively gets their own personal Copilot that knows exactly what their job is, all the context that they need to know to do it. And now suddenly becomes super, super powerful because, even on a service desk, I've got people that specialize in one area, even if they're ostensibly doing the same sort of job. Or if you have them, grouped in different areas, right? So it's just this idea that this is what I work on, or maybe even this is where I need help with. And I'm already seeing that. Like I'm trying to learn Spanish, and one of the things I do is I have a formal learning program, but I actually trained ChatGPT to actually become a Spanish tutor where I can converse. And I gave it special instructions. And, I think that the early stages of that sort of personalization. And the last one we talked about, the evolution of agents. Don't believe all the hype right now. I'm a fan of Salesforce and what they do in general, but this idea that we're just going to unleash thousands of agents all over the enterprise just doesn't really make a lot of sense right now. But I do believe we are going to be moving to this greater level of autonomy where we're going to have much more complex decision making, much more complex problem solving that can happen more autonomously. And I think one of the challenges for everyone here and every IT leader is going to be, where is that water's edge? How much autonomy do we want them to act with? Where do we feel comfortable with that? And as the technology gets there, and I think this is we're talking months here, like in the next couple of years, that we'll be facing these decisions. You need to be prepared to really ferret that out, which goes all the way back to why data and workflows are so absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Because in order to trust something to act autonomously, you have to have a workflow well defined, and you need to have data you can trust. And so they all, which is why, why we're so focused on all of this, that it all comes together. We don't believe you can have just kind of one piece of the puzzle. Anything you want to add before we wrap this up?
No, we promised we'd give 10 minutes for Q&A, and turns out we lied, Charlie. We were having too good of a discussion. So we've got 4 minutes left.
Yeah, we had lots of questions in there. So it's like, I feel like we did pretty good with that.
Fantastic. Yep.
So any other questions? This is your chance. Before we wrap this up, we'll give here a pause. Tim and I will banter for 30 seconds if you have any other questions that you'd like to throw out there. But I think overall, Tim, this has been important. I mean, to me, the judge of a good event is I learned something, and I definitely have learned something from you in this process. So what is your takeaway? What is if you were to, if someone is tuning in here, they showed up, they got their time wrong, they showed up for the last 60 seconds, how can you summarize everything we talked about, the big takeaway for them?
Yeah, I mean, I guess big takeaway, I think copilots it's definitely the future that we're going to, good, bad, or ugly. I think we're surrounded by them right now. It's just in its infancy. It's going to be in every product and everything that we consume very soon if it's not already there. So just kind of understanding where the technology is going and then adapting your organization to meet that. And the benefits to me right now they're quite amazing when it comes to Copilot and the flexibility that it has, and something that's fun and a little nerve-wracking when we're doing these demos, since it is like talking to a human. Like we were talking about before, Charlie. Someone could ask us, what's the weather today? And we could be literally in the exact same location, and we would both give the correct answer just in a slightly different way. And that's what it's like talking to a Copilot right now. It really is like talking to another person. So, it's something that I think folks need to take advantage of. Recognize why the organization wants to move in that direction and what issues can they solve for. And then I think you'll see the benefits very soon.
Yeah, and my last takeaway is really just to extend that. Actually, is not something that we even said, but I think is important to say, and that is that we're in this interesting brief window of time where right now this is still sort of experimental. People are still curious about it. And I think within the next 12 to 24 months, we're going to cross that chasm, and it will be an expectation that our employees within the organization, our customers, are going to have so much exposure to this technology that they're going to expect it. And it's going to be, very similar to when I wrote my first book. It was really about the dawn of the Facebooks and the Apple iPhone, where suddenly we had this highly consumerized technology that worked. It was intuitive. And people came into the office with a bunch of green screens and said, why do I have this horrible technology that I'm trying to do this job? And I think with something like a Copilot, it's going to be very similar, that right now, it's okay if you don't have something, if you're not going down that AI road, but within the next couple of years, it's going to flip, and it's going to be a detriment to you if you don't have an answer and you're not going down that road. So that would be my big takeaway. Well, with that, I think we are going to wrap this up. Thank you all for joining us. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I hope you found some value of it. If you have any other questions, please send us an email, reach out to me or Tim. If you'd like a demo, we'd, of course, would love to show that to you. But otherwise, thanks for coming, and we will see you at the next event. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.